Hi, everyone. Welcome to Interchange. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about the deadly violence which continues each and every day in Egypt and what, if any, effect it has on our lives. We'll talk about the owner of an old school Milwaukee bar shooting and killing an alleged would-be robber Thursday night. And we will talk about whether the controversial Act 10 in Wisconsin is actually helping local communities balance their budgets. We will also talk about the ongoing fight between Time Warner Cable and WTMJ-TV. All right, let me introduce everybody. We have Joel McNally, longtime newspaper columnist. Gerard Randall, education consultant, local job creation expert. And you know Denise Callaway, communications and public relations professional. Mr. Rick Horowitz will be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, let's talk first about the deadly violence taking place in Egypt every day. The military-backed government is cracking down heavy-duty on demonstrations by Muslim supporters of democratically elected but deposed President Mohamed Morsi. What is also troubling every time you see the bloody pictures is the realization that the United States continues to give Egypt hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid. Is the Egyptian government using our money to attack their own people? And is it possible to say that's in our own best interest?
Well, for right now, it's in our own best interest to continue to remain allies with Egypt. I think there were a series of missteps that we may have made in how we aligned ourselves with the government that came into succession with the support of the Muslim Brotherhood. I still have some mixed feelings about that. Certainly it's played out in such a way that what we're seeing now is this violence that I think ultimately is going to be civil war. I don't see the current government being able to put an end to the situation quickly or cleanly, for that matter, because already there's been this massive massacre of their own citizens. And then even when they try to put out news reports of how the police officers should be accorded the same respect as many of the protesters who had been murdered, they're not getting the same kind of traction. So there's a deep feeling of support, I think, from many of the Muslim Brotherhood members and their sympathizers, and certainly this kind of wholesale shooting and bulldozing of folk doesn't tend to garner any support for a fledgling government either. Suez Canal. That's our primary reason for wanting to maintain our support with Israel. Yes, it's all about oil, and it's been that case. It's been that way for better than a century. The sad reality for us is that as we lessen our dependence on oil, and certainly we lessen our dependence on oil from the Middle East, does that mean we're going to then lessen our support for Egypt? I think this prompts it. It forces the U.S. to look at other ways in which we can get oil delivered from that area, or it will certainly hasten our efforts to lessen our dependence on Middle East oil.
Denise, so many people argue that everything we do in the Middle East has to do with oil and how important oil is to us. So do we have to be friendly to whoever is in charge at this time in Egypt, or do we just sit back and watch how things play out?
Well, I think Egypt is much more complex than just the issue of oil and the Suez Canal. Its proximity to Israel, which is one of our closest allies, really makes paying attention to what happens in Egypt and being a good partner with Egypt something that's really important. Here's the dilemma that we're really in now. Don't know that we had the right kinds of conversations with the military when it came in and overthrew the former president, Mubarak. Don't know that that happened. Problem now is we really can't take a look at cutting military aid. I think that's very difficult for us to do, because if we do it without that aid, the military surely is going to collapse, and then what do we have? So we come back to that question of the devil that you know versus the devil that you don't. What's happening in Egypt now is absolutely abhorrent. It's terrible, but we have got to try to figure out a way. You know, I've heard the discussion put this way. We can have a positive, there's some positive influences we can have and some negative influences we can have. Unfortunately for us, the list of negative influences that we have, or that we have the ability to have, is very long, and the positive ones are extremely short. I think what we have to do is what I'm sure has been going on now through back channels and channels that we don't know about, where there continues to be a discussion with Egypt about what is happening and the military, needing to be able to back off. Gerard's right, though. I mean, it's not just a matter of the military really stepping in. You have the Muslim Brotherhood and other supporters of Mubarak who really feel that there was a coup, because there was a coup. And they really are very reluctant to step back. So we've got to, I think the best thing we can do is to really work with some other Middle Eastern countries to really intercede on not only our behalf, but their behalf as well. What can Jordan help us do in terms of working with those individuals who are leaders and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, which started the ball rolling with these massive protests that we're taking? How can we work that channel, and then how can we work with the Egyptian military? I think if we can't find a way to approach this from two different ends with help from some of their other allies in the Middle East, we are seeing the beginning of what's going to be a bloody, prolonged civil war in Egypt. And that is going to have an impact on gas prices and oil prices, because there's going to be a concern about the ability of the Suez Canal to be able to stay open.
So many times through history, when we've been involved financially and with boots on the ground in situations in all parts of the world, we hear people say, well, we have to do what we can to encourage democracy. If Morsi was a democratically elected president, do we have a responsibility to encourage that he be put back into place?
No. And that's why the whole approach that, we want to install democracy in these undemocratic countries is too simple-minded in the real world. Yes, he was elected in a democratic election and immediately started acting very undemocratic, cracking down on civil liberties, cracking down on free press and free speech in that country. He in fact, is the one who brought on the overthrow that the military then stepped in to keep the country together after there were riots in the street to remove him from office. And it's also why we can never, put things in this simple-minded kind of, as both my colleagues have said, there's a very nuanced situation here. And
I'm glad you didn't call me simple-minded.
Yeah, no, I'm calling you nuanced. But truthfully, I am so glad that we have intelligent leadership in this country right now that is not immediately talking about intervening militarily in a situation we don't know. There's no good side to get on. First of all, if we're going to intervene, do we intervene for the democratically elected, undemocratic former president, or do we intervene for the Muslim Brotherhood that wants to bring him back? I mean, or do we intervene for a military government but is now killing, their own citizens in the streets? I'm so glad that we now look at, military option as a last resort. The previous administration horribly, eagerly got us into a war that we were in for 10 years. And that should always be the last resort. We have to stay involved, and that's where the military aid and humanitarian aid we're talking about comes into play.
All right, next topic. A shooting on Thursday night at the popular old-school Kohansky's Concertina Bar Hall on Milwaukee's South Side. The owner pulls out a gun, reportedly shoots and kills a would-be robber. Is that stupid, or it is exactly what you want a business owner should do if you're in a bar and you're a customer? Do you want the owner to do that, or should he have said, oh, whatever goes, goes?
Well, given that this isn't the first time it's happened for this bar owner, I'm assuming that from his first experience, he felt this was something that he had to do in order to protect his property, protect the lives of his customers and his own life. You would think that after it had happened once before, it wouldn't happen again. Boom, it happened again. I wouldn't be out there celebrating him as a hero by any stretch. I think it's tragic. Any loss of life is tragic. The folk who came in there wielding guns should have been just as sanguine about what the outcome was going to be for them as well. People in this state now arm themselves. and they have the right to arm themselves and keep those weapons concealed. So if you think you're going to approach someone with a gun, hold them up, not have your own life be in jeopardy as a result, that's bad thinking. And I think that's what happened in this situation.
There are a lot of people today celebrating the owner of this bar as a hero, saying, you know, somebody's going to think twice now about walking into that bar and trying to rob it again.
Truthfully, I'm very suspicious about the way this even emerged in the media, to tell you the truth. I actually have been in the Concertina bar under a previous ownership where it was kind of a traditional land. I actually took a travel crew there once who were visiting Milwaukee. Here is some real strange things going on in Milwaukee. And the patrons that I remember at Art Dahlberg's Concertina bar would have had real trouble getting out of the way of people if shooting started in that bar. It was an old traditional crowd. This guy has come out in the media and in the social media bragging that you know, his bar is safe from these thugs. I don't even know who this guy is. You know, I don't want to be in a bar where shootouts happen, whether the bullets are coming from the other side of the bar or you know, somebody who walked in, and he's obviously putting himself out there as a hero, and that's a little bit offensive to me because a human being died in this whole affair.
But it's his bar, his property, his customers. Doesn't he have a right to protect them?
He has a right to protect them, and protecting them doesn't always mean you pull out your own gun from behind the bar and start shooting. You asked Gerard, you know, wouldn't you want to be in a bar where someone, you know, decided they were going to step up to protect me? I would like to be in a bar where I'm not worried about bullets flying, because it doesn't really matter whether they're flying from the owner or they're flying from the would-be robbers who are now shooting back at the owner who's shooting at them. I think that the idea of feeling that this was something that to protect patrons potentially put patrons at even greater risk. And I think Gerard's absolutely right. People perhaps now are going to think that bar owners are arming themselves. If that's the case, it makes a difference in terms of how they approach coming into establishments if they're going to rob them. Are they going to assume now that somebody has a gun, so I better shoot first before they do, when in fact in the past, maybe they were just going to go in to hold up the bar? It's a really complicated issue that we're dealing with, but you know, quite frankly, my feeling on this all along has been, if somebody is robbing you, you call the police. You don't pull out your own weapon. You don't start shooting and cause those people who may be robbing you to shoot back. It puts everyone in an extremely dangerous position. Right now, the person who was killed was someone who was trying to rob them. That's still a loss of life that, as far as we know, didn't have to take place. Not in any way at all justifying somebody coming in and deciding they're going to rob an establishment. But it's not the kind of crime that you pay for with your life.
You know what exacerbates a lot of this, though, is this hype that has occurred in this community in the last few months around the shooting deaths, particularly those on the near south side and on the north side. And some in the media are not being very honest in their assessment of what's taking place, and that has led to this spread of, in some cases, unjustifiable fear all over town that the city has gone to hell in a handbasket. Now that I don't believe. I do believe that there are pockets of crime that can be addressed in a very aggressive way. But this was more one of those random kinds of situations, not indicative of what this city is like as a whole.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Milwaukee County Executive Chris Abele said the other day that Milwaukee County is in a much better financial position than it was just 2 years ago. Part of the credit goes to the controversial Wisconsin law, Act 10, which allows counties to have workers pick up a bigger portion of the cost of their benefits. So, is Act 10 working exactly as Governor Scott Walker said it would?
Boy, I've gotten all three toughies to start out with. Yeah, it's working exactly as the governor had predicted that it would. It's saving municipalities money that they otherwise would have had to have contributed to pension or health care plans. the complaint that the municipalities would have is that the sharing of funds that have been generated as savings at the state level have not been kicked back to those communities in the long-held program of shared revenue between the state and local governments. And so they're still stressed in many ways with their budgets, but certainly not as much as they had been. So the county executive comes out and he says, we're not facing the kinds of budget stresses that we faced in the past. We can deal with this $16 million shortfall. We won't have to use gimmicks in order to address it. They put a happy face on it, but the truth of it is that if you don't have to pay more into pensions, if you don't have to cover 100% of the cost of health care, you're going to save money on the employer side. And that's where these municipalities are experiencing what the governor had predicted would be the outcome.
Now, Denise, do you think we're going to start seeing this in school districts as well, where they say, oh, we don't have the big financial problems we thought we had?
Well, I mean, a couple things about Act 10. I mean, Act 10 was very specific in the legislation that it put into place, but you have to remember, in the case of, at least when we're talking about Milwaukee County, Milwaukee Public Schools, and to an extent the city of Milwaukee, those entities were already doing some things before Act 10. So, for example, in the case of the county had already worked to refinance some of its debt. So that really is something that helped to contribute to the savings. In the case of Milwaukee Public Schools, the board had already made some changes to the pension benefits for retirees and some other changes to current employees. That was before Act 10. So Act 10 has helped in some ways, but it's also, particularly when you take a look at cities, it's also hampered cities. So we take a look at the city of Milwaukee. City of Milwaukee says it saved about $20 million because of Act 10. But when you take a look at the reductions it's seen in shared revenue, you combine that with the fact that because police and fire are exempt from Act 10 and the additional costs that they continue to pay for police and fire, the city actually sees itself, according to its calculations, in the hole a couple of $1 million because of Act 10, because it didn't allow it to take full ability of the pension and other changes that came for public employees. Plus, it's receiving significantly less in shared revenue. So while Act 10 may have helped in some cases, it hasn't been a panacea in terms of making sure that communities could save dollars, and it doesn't give credit to those communities that were already forward thinking about what they needed to do.
Has it been all bad news, Act 10?
All bad news? It's certainly been plenty of bad news, and that's what I want to bring up because of what's been said so far. I agree with much of what Denise just said, but when you talk about saving money for every level of government, whether it's schools, cities, counties, the state, there's another way to interpret saving money. It is cutting the pay and jobs of people all over this state. That is why the job creation in Wisconsin has been so miserable. Act 10 blew a major hole in the Wisconsin state economy. If people all over the state have less money to spend, they spend less money, and businesses in Wisconsin create fewer jobs, create fewer products, because the people all over the state of Wisconsin, teachers throughout the state of Wisconsin, any city, county, state employee through the state of Wisconsin is receiving less money because all these wonderful savings we're praising is money out of people's pockets all over the state, which so far has kept the state of Wisconsin miserable in job creation. That's why we do lag behind the rest of the country. It is not, wonderful news that, we've cut all the money to all these people all over the state of Wisconsin, because that's hurting people all over the state of Wisconsin and hurting businesses and job creation all over the state of Wisconsin.
All right, let's take just a few minutes to talk about the fight between Time Warner Cable and WTMJ-TV, now entering its 4th week, still going strong as of tonight, Friday night. With WTMJ-TV off the cable system completely, who appears to be the biggest winner and who's the loser in this fight? I can't tell.
You can't tell, and there's no way of telling. I mean, they basically are going to negotiate an agreement. They've already alienated a lot of their customers, but that's what negotiation is. You're supposed to come up with, a compromise that'll give both sides something that they want. And hanging over this whole business is whether cable systems are actually on their way out, because they're losing customers to online, media, movies and TV shows, and some created especially for the web, the World Wide Web, and young people are getting, series and watching shows that we don't even know about that are delivered into their homes over the web much cheaper than these exorbitant rates that we're paying all the time for hundreds of channels, most of which we don't watch.
The reality is this has to be hurting WTMJ's ratings. It is hurting WTMJ's ratings.
Sure.
You wonder if the advertisers are getting pretty upset with WTMJ, and at the same time, it has to be hurting the number of people that are subscribing to Time Warner Cable, saying, I'm out of here, I'm going to go get, the dish or something.
Right, because the biggest losers in all of this are the people who subscribe to Time Warner Cable, who watch Channel 4 because you're paying for a product that you're not getting.
And the dish, had the same, argument
issue.
too.
I think the real issue is, how we begin to handle looking at these rebroadcast rights, because that's what's at the heart of it. Channel 4 wants more money that's more comparable to what other folks are getting in the marketplace, and Time Warner, it's its own business, doesn't want to pay them that amount of money.
And if they pay them, they'll raise the rates for their customers.
Well, and they'll blame it then on Channel 4. But I think it really is becoming a challenge for cable companies to figure out, what's this mix for them. And television stations, I think, rightfully expect that if you're rebroadcasting the product that I'm paying to produce, I need to be able to be compensated for that. The really interesting thing is what appears to be at the heart of this, isn't really Channel 4. It's really a bigger question in the cable market that's really around this compensation that is in large part not driven by local programming, it's driven by sports programming. And the increasing cost of sports programming that cable companies are trying to find some way, and quite frankly, over-the-air broadcasters like CBS, don't go to Los Angeles or Chicago or New York and expect to see, your CBS station, because they're shut out. They shut out all the owned and operated stations in their largest markets.
And it's important to remember, too, that this is probably not a local fight.
No,
this is not a local fight.
Not by a long shot.
Time Warner Cable headquarters is probably calling the shots on this.
Absolutely, and they are calling the shots on this. I'm a huge Time Warner Cable fan, but that's about as far as it really goes, because they're just a conduit for programming. What will ultimately happen is Time Warner, the larger company, will become more deeply involved in creating their own programming to deliver over these newer sources of delivery systems that young people are certainly far more in tune to, the Netflix of the world, the Hulus. I can't even fathom that yet. But that's what I think we're going to see these mega companies move more towards, the programming aspect, and then they're just going to sail along with whatever the new conduits are for delivering those programs.
Okay, we have to move on. A few more thoughts now about the awful situation in Egypt. Rick Horowitz has been watching the carnage mount up over these past few days, and he's been wrestling with what it says about America's influence. Rick.
The best part about being the planet's only superpower? You get to decide what happens everywhere in the world. You give the orders and everybody else does exactly what you want. The worst part about being the planet's only superpower? Everything I just said is a myth, a fantasy. People may think it's true, but it's not. They may want it to be true or fear that it's true, but it's not. So let's talk about the United States and Egypt. What's going on in Egypt right now is horrible. It's profane. Security forces firing on overwhelmingly peaceful protesters. Hundreds shot dead, thousands more wounded. A society recently edging toward democracy now threatening to unravel. And what are we doing to stop it? Not enough, obviously, because it's still going on. But what could we be doing to stop it? That's the harder question, isn't it? The front page headline in Friday's New York Times summed it up pretty well. His options few, Obama rebukes Egypt's leaders. His options few. Ain't that the truth? Egypt's leaders have already ignored all our earlier urgings and warnings and threats. When it came to cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood, they probably figured we'd look the other way. And given our long and often sordid history in that part of the world, supporting whatever autocrat we thought would best protect our interests, you couldn't see why they'd think that. Even this time, even after the Army had removed President Morsi and put its own people in charge, we still couldn't bring ourselves to call it a coup and cut off the $1 billion+ in aid we provide every year. An easy call, right? Except, of course, that we don't give them all that money out of simple generosity. We give it because we thought that a strong Egyptian military makes for a safer and more secure Middle East, which makes us safer right here at home. So we held back. They didn't. So now our president has strongly condemned the crackdown. He's called for the violence to end. He's canceled next month's joint military training exercises, and he's told his national security team to consider additional steps, all of which might accomplish nothing. The excruciating truth? What's happening in Egypt may be beyond the reach of anyone but the Egyptians themselves, not even the planet's only superpower.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.